everyone. Welcome back to our weekly Bible reading videos. Today we take a look at Samson, who is a study in contrast with other great figures in the Bible. First of all, though, you'll notice that in between Jephthah and Samson, there is a little lull in which we get a very brief word about a few different judges. There is a sense of peace in between these two larger-than-life characters who do not provide a whole lot of peace for the people of Israel. And so it reminds us, and there was this also between Gideon and Jephthah and between some of the others, it reminds us that God is being gracious to the people by allowing them some periods of rest between periods of turmoil. And we should look at God as being gracious to us in providing us little portions of Sabbath, little times of rest. Not necessarily that we should see those as breaks in between great periods of stress or great periods of disappointment, as we see in Jephthah and in Samson. But we should take those little periods of rest where we can find them and use them to connect to God and to receive the renewal of the Lord. But we come to Samson, and like I said, he is a study of contrast between great biblical figures and himself. And you see some parallels, even at the very beginning of his story, of how he had the opportunity to be a great hero of the faith. And you know, we often think of Samson as one of these great heroes, but as we read through his story, he really is not a hero whatsoever. And we see in Samson proof of what we've talked about before, and that is the permissive will of God, that God can use imperfect people to accomplish things for His kingdom, even if they are not really aligned with God or they're not doing what is right in God's eyes. It reminds us of the overwhelming graciousness and mercy of our God, that He will accomplish His good works even when He has to use imperfect people like us. Even when we are not faithful, God is faithful. And that this reminds us, as one scholar put it, of the incarnational nature of God's work, that God decides to work in the present world, in present people, that He is involved in history even when history itself is imperfect. And it just shows, again, God's covenant faithfulness to us, to His people, to His world, that He will work through people like Samson, that He will work through people like us. God is near to us. God is incarnational. God is present, even when we do not live up to His goodness and live up to His character. Of course, that is not for us to use as an excuse to say, okay, well, I'll just let myself be a part of the permissive will of God. We still want to be a part of the perfect will of God, and so we are called to be faithful. We are called to follow God's lead, and we can learn as much from Samson by seeing what he did that we should not do as we could if Samson were a positive model of faithfulness. But let's look at his life and see the lessons we can learn, see how he compares and contrasts to other biblical figures, and maybe we can learn some lessons of how to be faithful by looking at his life. First of all, Samson is the promised child. We see this theme throughout the Bible, from the days of Isaac through to later on we see Samuel, and then of course Jesus himself and John the Baptizer. They're also examples of this chosen child that is meant to do great things for God. Moses is another, and we see some obvious parallels between Moses and just the judges in general. They were supposed to deliver their people Israel through the power of God. But what is different is how this chosen child ends up. Whereas Moses is by and large faithful, whereas Samuel is very faithful, whereas even Isaac, even though he's not mentioned much after his birth narrative, is faithful. Obviously John the Baptizer and Jesus are faithful. Samson is not. And a lot of that has to do with how he betrays the call of God that is on him from the moment of his conception. We read that his mother receives a visit from the angel of the Lord. We do not get the name for his mother, nor do we get the name really for the angel of the Lord. Is this Gabriel that we see later in the New Testament with John and Jesus? Is this an actual manifestation of the Lord himself? Is this sort of a pre-incarnation view of the Son of God? Is this kind of an ambiguous figure like we get in the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel of the Lord? We're not really sure, but it's interesting that the two people who are faithful to God in this passage do not have a name or are not given a name. And it's the people who do have a name, like Manoah, the father of Samson, who are not necessarily the most faithful in this story. This reminds us that being faithful to God doesn't always mean that we will get recognition or that we will get the thanks or the appreciation that is due to people who follow God. That sometimes our following of God is an anonymous following of God. We don't always get the credit for that. And yet we're still called to be faithful. Just like Samson's mother, who really held this promise and tried to help Samson hold to the promises of his birth. Like her, we can be faithful in a very unfaithful atmosphere. We do see in this narrative of Samson's birth that he comes from the tribe of Dan, which continues this pattern of different tribes being called upon to provide a judge for the people of Israel. Again, this symbolizes the fragmentary nature of the people of Israel. There is no one place or one tribe that has really emerged as the leader of the Israelites, but it also, I think, is God's call on them, signifies God's call on them to be united, that the leaders can come from different places, and that it's not about where the leader comes from, but about God's power working through them. But there's another thing that is peculiar to Samson, as he is called to be a Nazirite. And if we go back to the Pentateuch and see what the Nazirite vow is all about, we know about not partaking of any wine or strong liquor. We know about not having your head or face shaved. We know that these are some of the practices that the Nazirites undergo. Usually the Nazirite vow is a limited time period, but for Samson it is his whole life. And we understand that the Nazirite vow means to be set apart and to be holy for God. It is a sign that you belong completely to God and do not belong to the world. Samson will not live out this Nazirite vow. Of course, we know in the story of Samson and Delilah, he allows Delilah to know what his power source is, which is the Nazirite vow, which includes never shaving his head or beard. And yet he allows Delilah to know that, knowing, I think, he has to know from that whole story that she's then going to share that with the Philistines, and the Philistines are going to come and use that to take away his power. But there are other ways in which he does not stick to the Nazirite vow, which shows that Samson is a person called to faithfulness and yet is a person of faithlessness. For instance, even the name of the place that Delilah is from is an example of how Samson has betrayed the Nazirite vow. We read in chapter 16 that after this, Samson fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. The word Sorek literally means in the Hebrew a place of vines, of choice vines. What were vines used for? They were used to grow grapes, and grapes in that culture were used for wine. This is like Samson going to the Napa Valley in California. He is in wine country, and it's very unlikely that Samson, who has shown faithlessness up to this point, was able to go to wine country and not partake in the fruits of that region. And so he is obviously not taking his prohibition against alcohol seriously. We also see at other times where Samson is partying with this great feast around his wedding banquet earlier on when he marries the woman from Philistia. And we know that those types of festivals were full of wine, alcohol, drinking, and he likely was partaking in those as well. So he has broken that part of the Nazirite vow, not just the part about the not shaving of the head or beard. It is also very likely that Delilah is a Philistine. Even though we are not told that specifically, this valley of Sorek is in one of those borderlands between Philistia and Israel. And we know from the previous parts of the story that Samson has a particular fondness for Philistine women. We know that he asked his parents to arrange the marriage of him and the Philistine woman from Timnah. We know that he had a relationship with a Philistine prostitute after that. He is seeking out these Philistine women for relationships, which also shows a betrayal of his not only Nazirite vow, but the teachings of God not to intermarry with the people groups around Israel. Because what would happen, God knew, that if you intermarried with these groups, you would take on their culture, and that meant you would take on the worship of their gods. And so, again, Nazirite vows mean being separated and being holy for God. And Samson is intermarrying. He is carrying on relationships with women who are outside of the covenant community of Israel. There is also this whole matter with the lion and with the honey that comes out of the lion's carcass, which is an interesting story, but also shows that Samson is not taking his Nazirite vow seriously. Part of the Nazirite vow would be to not approach any dead body, whether that is a human dead body or a dead wild animal, as the lion would be. That was an unclean practice, and Samson, of course, has this dealing with the lion. He kills the lion, but then comes back and has this connection or this contact with the lion's carcass. So all of these are ways of the writer of Judges to tell us and to tell an Israelite audience who would have been familiar with these transgressions of the Nazirite law and the moral purity of the law. All of these are the writer's way of showing us that Samson is not serious about his vow, about his commitment and devotion to the Lord. Samson is faithless, but God is faithful. One of the statements that Samson makes about one of the reasons why he transgresses his covenant with God tells us a lot about the nature of sin and actually connects us back with the story of the first sin in Eden and also with the stories that are to come in the last part of the book of Judges. In chapter 14, when his parents challenge this idea of him going outside of Israel to find a spouse, he says this. This is in chapter 14, verse 3. Samson said to his father, "Get her for me, because she pleases me." Now this in the Hebrew is the statement, "She is pleasing to my eye." And this, you may remember, is one of the ways that the serpent tricked Adam and Eve into eating the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That the serpent told them, "It is pleasing to the eye." And then we read that Adam and Eve saw that the fruit was pleasing to the eye. Later on in the book of Judges, we will see that everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Or in other words, everyone did what was right or what was pleasing to them or pleasing to their eyes. In other words, everyone followed their sinful desires. We see that Samson, instead of being a great deliverer judge, is actually leading the people down a slope towards utter sinfulness, and that he is modeling for the people true faithlessness, true sinfulness, true separation from God, when he is supposed to be demonstrating for them righteousness, faithfulness, and separation to God and God's purposes. Another thing about Samson and his work as a judge is we never really see him taking on the mantle of leadership in Israel. Most of the violence that takes place here at Samson's hand is to avenge him, is to to make right a wrong that has been directed at him by the Philistines. And so he is not really fighting the Philistines on behalf of Israel to liberate the people. He is fighting the Philistines to settle a personal score in which he feels like he has been wronged in some way. That is a complete betrayal of what the judge is supposed to do. The judge is supposed to lead all of Israel into the safety of following God and being faithful to God. The judge is supposed to lead Israel in military conquest against the nations surrounding them so that they can be free of their influence and so that they can truly be that peculiar people set apart for God. And it just makes us realize how far we have come from people like Moses and Joshua. Not that Moses and Joshua were perfect, but how Moses and Joshua still did what they did on behalf of the people. This was not for personal gain for them. This was for the communal gain of all the people of Israel. Now, we will get back to that judge or prophet figure who will take up the mantle of leadership for Israel on behalf of all Israel so that they can be reunited with God and his purposes. We'll get that with Samuel as he comes into leadership after the book of Judges. But right now we have this very low point in which God's leaders are not living in to that communal leadership. This lack of good leadership then comes to influence the overall attitude of the Israelites and the way they see the Philistines and the Philistines ruling over them. They come to accept that. We see that in chapter 15 when some men of Judah come to capture Samson because he has opposed the Philistines, and they say this to Samson: "Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us?" They have accepted their bondage to the Philistines. That was never God's intention for the people of God. This is a fault of the people, but which came first? That's really the question we have to ask. Was it that they just had not had good godly leadership, so they had given up on God and God's purposes? Or is Samson, the leader, just reflecting back the attitudes of the people? Either way, we see that Samson and the leaders of the Israelites are culpable, and so are the people. And they are never supposed to accept the rule of this foreign people. This reminds us to never be accepting of sin in its place among us. We should never have the attitude that just says, you know what, sin is a fact of life, and so we don't want God's leadership anymore. In fact, all of this in the story of Samson is a reminder to us as the church and as Christians individually of the importance for us to not accept sin and faithlessness, to not allow ourselves to put other things in front of our devotion to God, and to take our separation to God as important. In other words, our holiness, our call to holiness is important. That we are to be separated from the ways of the world so that we can be God's people and we can live fully in God's will and God's purposes. Because when we do that, we will then have a positive influence and impact on the world around us. We will be strong witnesses. We will be able to do the work of evangelism that we've been talking about so far this year. If we first will give ourselves fully to God, then we will find ourselves as the leaders God has called us to be in the world, to help be ambassadors for Christ and to help turn the world back to the God who loves them. Samson's story ends in a very pitiable manner. It is not a highlight either for Samson or for the people of Israel. He finds himself captured, blinded by the Philistines. He finds himself on display for their enjoyment and for their amusement. And he does ask God for one last act of power for God to work through him so that he can at least have vengeance against this group of Philistine leaders who have gathered to mock him. And God does allow him to have one final show of strength, even though it costs him his life. And even though it ultimately does not lead to the freedom for all of Israel. Even this seems like a very personal request for Samson. It's let me have some vengeance over them. Let me have some redemption. Let me have this opportunity to show them that I am not just someone to be mocked and someone to be made fun of. It's not really let me do this on behalf of you, God, and on behalf of your people Israel. Even though God uses this as an opportunity to show God's strength and power and the weakness of the Philistine god Dagon. We see that the Philistine god is being celebrated in this kind of festival in which Samson is being mocked. So even though Samson may not really be focused on God and showing the power of God, God is going to use this as an opportunity to do that. We do see, of course, this idea of sacrificing Samson's life for some of God's purposes as an admirable thing. It does in some ways foreshadow the giving of Jesus' life on behalf of the whole world. But really it stands in stark contrast to Jesus' sacrifice. And it really emphasizes the ways in which Samson has not lived in to his call of leadership. Samson is no Christ-like figure. Jesus Christ was faithful completely, where Samson has been faithless up until this point. And so we are left as the readers, and especially as readers who have the benefit of New Testament hindsight, we are left with the question of, are we going to be Samsons or are we going to be followers of Jesus Christ? Are we going to be faithless or faithful? Are we going to work for God's purposes or our own purposes as Samson did? I hope we will choose to follow Christ and follow his example and to ask for God's power to be with us, for the Spirit to empower and equip us to be faithful disciples so that we might lead the world towards God. So continue to go out into the world, be faithful, follow God's leading, and be a good witness, be an evangelist for the kingdom of God. I will warn you that next week's readings, as we finish up the book of Judges, are very difficult readings. There are things within these chapters that should turn our stomachs quite a bit. So I just want to warn you as we go to these final readings. But they show us how much Israel had fallen from the days of Moses and Joshua. But the good news is that Israel does not depend on their own faithfulness, but that the God of grace and mercy is the one who sustains Israel and the one who sustains us still today. So allow him to work in his grace and goodness in your life. Have a great week, and I'll see you soon.